I was asking, I remember as a child, why? What does that mean to starve? For me, I had no conception of what that meant, and to not have food, to be completely sort of foodless. How is it possible? You can still go to the forest. You could move, right? You could do lots of things if you weren't able to get the food from what you sowed on the fields or in the store. But none of those things were possible for those people. And by what we mean by artificial man-made famine is that policies were put into place to prevent things like that from happening, meaning from people going out of their villages, from people going and collecting food on the field, or grass, or wheat, or whatever they could find. So the depravity of the whole situation is what we mean here by man-made famine. For me, this entire memory sort of etched into my brain vividly, and later on as an undergraduate student and graduate student, I kept on returning to this story and meeting wonderful people who survived, whose parents survived, whose grandparents survived this tragedy, and further enlightening myself. So for me, this is a very humbling experience because it's also a personal one. And it's no wonder that it's a personal one. Stories of genocide, these are all oral memories that are passed down from generation to generation of how history happened. How is it that it formed today me to be standing in front of you telling about what happened? So I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge that this is, despite some of the pictures you'll see, and mostly these are maps, I don't want to dehumanize the entire experience. We're talking about people, we're talking about lives that were lost, we're talking about children that weren't born. We're talking about human beings who were eaten. Stories of cannibalism at the time were rampant, and you will see this in diplomatic cables from ambassadors of Italy, from ambassadors of Austria, from archives in the Catholic Church in Rome. This is the tragedy that occurred, so I don't want in any way to sort of dehumanize the experience, despite talking about facts and numbers and showing pictures and so on. So an important thing that I want you to take away from this, at least from this map, is that there were parts of Ukraine that weren't affected by this tragedy. And the part that was affected is the one that actually stayed for a long time, was almost nullified through this experience. They weren't able to talk about this for a long time. And it is not surprising that this part, it is indeed this part of Ukraine where a lot of events and memories been preserved. There was greater freedom. They weren't incorporated in the Soviet Union until after the Second World War. So there was a lot more that happened in that interim of about 10 years to allow the people of this part of Ukraine sort of collect experiences, process that, and really be able to speak about it far more than those who experience it more directly. Another thing that I want you to take away from this is this geography matters. And this is another thing that came to me as I was maturing in my academic studies. What if I was born just across the border? What if I was born here? How random it was that my family wasn't as directly affected, but that some of my friends' families and those who were just across the border were. So this is my sort of encounter with geography and fascination with geography that I hope to sort of also translate through what I'm about to tell you. So what can geography tell us about the Great Famine? Now at Harvard, and you saw that in an introductory slide, I work for a project called Mapping the Great Famine, Holodomor. It's a collaborative project between researchers at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, Ukrainian Institute of Demography, scientists from universities in Canada, United States, who all collaborated to bring together all available data that you can possibly map using the digital tools, put them on the platform, and try to say what really happened. Now, I know that from the onset of this project, they also wanted to bring in this data from other parts of the Soviet Union, from, for example, Kazakhstan, which also was affected, not to the same degree, but nonetheless, from the parts of Russia as well, certain cities, again. But that hasn't been possible. That dialogue hasn't yet occurred in a way that it ought to have been, where we could map all of this and look at and really estimate and see Why was the distribution so uneven? What does it tell us about specific causes of deaths in Ukraine? What made Ukrainian famine special in relation to others? Special in the case that, and that will be part of my story. So what does geography tell us about the Great Famine? Three questions that we as researchers who were participating in this project tried to look for. We came with an open mind. Let's just bring in the data and see what happens. But what we tried to kind of interrogate are three key questions of what happened and why it happened and who was responsible. So I will tell you a little bit of conclusions that we've come to, and these are all preliminary. Constantly, researchers are now reaching out into this database, which I will introduce you to as well, and you can do this freely yourself. It's very user-friendly, I would argue. And look into what's been done and delve deeper into the subject. So, what does Holodomor mean? I think a lot of you might be wondering. Well, Holod means hunger, Ukraine, and Mor means extermination. So it's extermination by hunger would be a direct translation of Holodomor. In terms of the numbers, and I don't want to spend too much time. For those of you who are interested, I'm happy to send you recent scholarly research on this, again, from this team of international researchers who've been cranking numbers over the last several years. They took this job very seriously to really try to understand the demographics of famine in Ukraine. So now we have a number that's pretty accurate. 4.5 million estimated death with 3.9 million of direct losses. What do we mean by that? These are excess deaths. These are deaths that wouldn't have occurred if the famine wasn't there, if this artificial famine wasn't there. And 0.6 million of indirect losses. These are lost birth. In demographers' talk, these are births that would have happened, but sadly because of the circumstances they did not. What did that direct loss mean in terms of population loss? In 1993, Ukraine's population was about 26 million people. So that meant and translated into about 13% of deaths, 4% of which was urban and 16% rural. So in essence, every 8th Ukrainian died of the Soviet Ukraine died and perished in this famine. Another sort of myth, but many of you might not have followed this story as much, contrary to some of the scholarship that has emerged, the famine didn't begin in 1932. It actually started in fall and winter 1931, claiming its first major wave of victims in the spring of 1932. And the hardest hit was the Kyiv Oblast. I'll show you it on the map where that was, around the cities of Bila Tserkva and Umay. And you can already start looking at some of the first memoirs of people in these cities who survived or left some trace in their historical memory of what happened. So by this time, the Soviet authorities already knew what was happening. Ukrainian communist leaders were already urging the Politburo in Moscow to pay attention to this, to release them from their procurement expectations, demands. And I will delve a little bit and explain what these terms mean. They might be unfamiliar to this audience. So further, I just want to emphasize that in 1933, Ukraine consisted of these 8 regions, and it was divided in oblasts, in rayons, rural and urban. And you'll be seeing them on the map, 392 of them. So a lot of data is basically using these rayons and oblasts in order for us to discuss losses and try to see the geographic distribution. So let's look at the geography of death in Ukraine. So these are the 8 oblasts. You can see Chernihiv, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Stalino, which is now kind of known as Donetsk region, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, Tiraspol, which is now an independent Moldovan country, at the time republic, Transnistria, I'm sorry, and Vidice. So both for Bila Tserkva and Umay were in Kyiv Oblast. And the first bar is 1932. The second blue one represents losses. These are excess death, remember, direct losses of 33, and these are of 34. So this is for us to have a sort of beginning to have an understanding of the geography of death and who was and where in Ukraine affected the most. Now what we see from this map already is that something unusual for those who study famines or studied previous famines in Ukraine, or famines that happened afterwards, since famines were quite frequent in that part of the world. And the reason for that is this is quite a dry area of Ukraine. This specific area that I'm circling right now is known as Black Earth region of Ukraine, which is most fertile land, but also it used to, or you would get quite dry when weather would be not conducive in that particular year. So previous famines would really, we would see deaths happening in this part of Ukraine, Odessa, Stalingrad. Instead, what we see in terms of largest loss of life actually occurred in ecologically speaking, in boreal area of Ukraine. This is an area where you have more wooded areas, atypical for Ukraine as well. So moving forward, building on what just said, this is a map of comparison between famine intensity in April 1922. There was a lesser famine happening that time. And most scholars come to conclude that this was really more of a natural disaster that happened, and many reasons for that. But you can see how it's also this distribution of this famine is very clear. The clustering is very clear. This is atypical for famines that happen due to natural causes. This is very atypical. Nature doesn't do this. Men do. And that's the rest of my story. So when we look at total direct famine losses in Ukraine for 1933, which is what this map is showing at the bottom, the darker areas are the areas with most deaths. These are rayons, remember, 392 rayons in which Soviet Ukraine was divided into. So moving forward, I want to speak a little bit about the ethnic composition, since for us to really conceptualize the famine and really understand what it was about, it's important to answer the question of who was affected by this. Ukraine was, at that time, Soviet Ukraine, multi-ethnic state, as it is today. Many people are living in it of different origin: Germans, Poles, Bulgarians, Russians, Jews, Romanians, Greeks in the south. This was a multi-ethnic nation, and therefore, when the policy was conceived, especially as it intensified, everybody got affected. But it's important to distinguish that between why it was created in the first place. And I do like, and I would like to draw a parallel between, in some way, between, we know that the Nazi regime perpetrated a larger policy across the entire European continent in exterminating people. But what happened in the tragedy of the Jewish people was very particular. It had particular cause and its particular sort of dynamic and reasons. But there's also a larger story. And in a similar way in Ukraine, although specifically this famine was targeted against Ukrainian nationalism, there are other people who got affected and died because of this. And so in telling of the story of the famine, it's important to understand that, and I'll speak about it in a minute. So instead of just showing you these static maps, I want to actually show you, if this system will allow me, how it looks like. So this is the web map, which all of you have access to. You can go into it and play around with these different fancy layers that are created, talking about ethnic composition, collectivization, ecology, and agriculture, all different kinds of data points that are entered in there, and some of which you can overlay to create and discover new puzzles about why this happened, what effect it had, and frankly discovering new questions that we don't yet know about this particular disaster. But as I said, I wanted to look and show you, in fact, also it's very hard to represent this data in a static format, so that's why I'm also using this tool. So here I clicked on a legend where I wanted to see losses by nationalities. Year is 1933, per 1,000 of ethnic group, people of a particular ethnic group. And these are charts. So some of the largest groups, so we'll look at first would be Ukraine as a total. Then we have Russians as total, Jews as total, Poles as total, and Germans. So these are the different graphs that you will be able to see. And Ukrainians would be the largest bar in all of them. But nonetheless, it's important to pay attention to. So you can all look into a specific ethnicity that you're interested in. So if we look, for example, for Kyiv, it will tell you how many Ukrainians, how many Russians, and Jews were lost per 1,000 in that specific oblast. So you can really see and discover this for yourself. What the losses were and what the compositions were. So I'm not going to stop here. I'll come back to my presentation, but I would encourage you, and I'll say a few words about that more broadly, what conclusions you come to when you start playing with this data and what at least I've concluded. But I encourage that you yourself, if you're interested, go into it and explore further. So what we know in terms of ethnic losses is that although most people were affected, it's the rural communities that were affected the most. And the village was the heart of Ukrainian soul in many ways. Peasants were predominantly Ukrainian. Other nationalities such as Russians or Jewish populations were mostly in cities, by and large, not all, but by and large. And cities are the ones who were less affected by this. It was the village, it was the countryside, and the farmers who were affected the most. So we just examined this, and why did this man-made famine occur? Now that we've looked at sort of a little bit of what happened, I want to try to give you some context as to why it occurred. So first thing that you come to conclude when you examine the evidence is that Stalin's policies of procurement, and especially blacklists, and I'll speak about those in a minute, had one of the greatest effects on famine. And the reason for that was simple. When you begin looking at the documents, both within the discussions between Soviet leaders and the discussion between the leaders of the Soviet Ukraine and leaders in Moscow, when they started to think of and began to implement the policy of industrialization in the Soviet Union, the additional policy that was brought into force is collectivization, right? So village life was collectivized. It was more collectivized in the eastern part and the southern part of Ukraine, and I'll show you the map in a second. But in this collectivization drive, you had both collective farms and still individual farmers. So this was still sort of not a closed case, but nonetheless, this was a form of a kind of a land reform, and the government had, or Kremlin was issuing orders to local party officials to collect certain percentage of wheat or whatever it is that they were planting that particular year. So these procurement plans were quite high. And the distribution of these plans is what starts to explain some of this picture. The blacklists are lists that the Soviet government created for certain particular villages in Ukraine that no longer had anything to offer in terms of requisitions. They no longer had even any seeds that they could actually plant and then grow further wheat, for example, from. But in that blacklist villages, they would take everything from the family. They would take any scraps of food, all animals, any kind of cattle, everything would be taken away, basically saying you cannot survive, period. On top of that, these villages, communities who were on the blacklist, they were not able to leave their place of residence. If they were even to reach the city, they would be deported back. They could not leave the country. So they were locked into these communities where they're living, and surely many of them died. So that's just an explanation of the concepts that are being used by scholars, but also more widely with those who look into Soviet history. So we can see collective farm sector procurement, and these are fulfillments in Ukraine in 1933. And you see that these areas that are darker shaded are the areas where fulfillment was almost 100%. So this is already experiences of famine. These are people who already have nothing to eat practically, and yet they are fulfilling their plans, right? In comparison to regions like Dnipropetrovsk, Stalina, or Odessa, which aren't really able to deliver as much. So the leaders in Soviet Ukraine at the time, those Ukrainian communist leaders, started to write letters to Stalin saying, we need to lower procurement plans for this part. People are dying. They won't have anything to sow. We won't have any harvest from here next year. But that was already fallen on deaf ears, and eventually they even further increased these procurement plans and relaxed them for these particular regions. So this is just further to illustrate this. I want to look at sort of a rayon level to see this. And again, this is fulfillment of procurement plan in Ukraine between 30 and 31. So you can see on the map where the blue areas is what was basically delivering at a pretty high rate for the country. This means that everything was requisitioned from these places. So even if they found no wheat in either individual or collective farms, they would then collect whatever foodstuff they could find or whatever cattle they could find to sort of substitute for the fact that these peasants were failing to deliver what the government required them or asked them to do. This is just in the next year, 31, 32, you see how it begins to worsen up here in the Kyiv region. And by 32, 33, we can more clearly see the sort of regional dynamic as well, right? 72%, 99%, 100% in these areas. So again, this is further illustration on more on a sub-regional level, on the rayon level of how procurement as a policy by the government and Soviet leaders were perfectly aware of what they were doing in this. When they wrote a quota for a specific oblast, they knew very well that these peasants would not be able to deliver, and that in fact they would have to, other food stuff would be taken away from them. So this was very much a deliberate policy. Something I already mentioned, it's a form of a land reform in the Soviet Union, collective ownership of land. For those of you who maybe have some context in the history of the Russian Empire would know that peasants sort of owned, well, there was a reform, but nonetheless, the peasants more or less by 1920s owned their land. And with the coming of Lenin and the communist regime, there was a policy of beginning to collectivize. But Lenin wasn't enforcing it as much for a number of reasons, international situation included. But it was really under Stalin that that policy took its root and started to being developed and treated more seriously. In the terminology of the Soviet Union, they came up with a concept of the kulak, which is a wealthy peasants. Ukraine didn't have actually many wealthy peasants, but this was a term for used by Stalin across a lot of parts of the Soviet Union in order to cut out any kind of national movement. You can see it in other countries as well, not just in the Soviet Republic. But what did that mean in effect is if you were even thought by a neighbor or that you were kulak or a bit wealthier than your neighbor, the government would then just step in and say, we're collectivizing, we're taking away everything you have. Most of families were split, actually. So mom would be sent to Siberia, dad would be sent to Tajikistan, children would be sent elsewhere, and that way the entire fabric of life was destroyed. Again, for many of you who have, or hopefully have come into contact with Ukrainian culture would know how much Ukrainian culture owns to the village. From the song, from the singing, bandura we see it in the room here, which is a very folk instrument, a peasant instrument in many ways. The singing, to the dancing, the stories. The heart of the nation was in village life. And when you begin to destroy that, you don't just destroy culture, you don't just destroy families, you destroy the way of life. So, as a note to collectivization, what do we see in terms of losses? We see that places that have been collectivized, which was greater in the south and east parts of Soviet Ukraine, they actually didn't suffer as much in terms of deaths, right? But places actually where the ownership, individual ownership of the farms remained high, are the ones who suffered the most as well. And the reason for that is because these parts of Ukraine were resisting collectivization. Throughout 1931, 32, they were protesting. Something around 4,000 protests broke out in 1932 against collectivization. People didn't want to leave their places, give up their cattle and so on and so forth into the collective farm. And in order to sample out this resistance, basically this policy was also instituted of forced collectivization, and also, in effect, famine as a policy sort of encouraged, if you like, or used as an opportunity to kill off that national sentiment that was coming from it. So if we look at collectivization and direct famine losses in Ukraine, again by region, so this is households sort of collectivized as of October 1932, and the red one is sort of collectivized, and the yellow part is not collectivized. So this is another way to kind of visualize that data and to see how many were not collectivized, and then relate that to the excess death that we talked about. Again, another way of looking at it. So, additional element into procurement, continued procurement, and in fact, the procurement rates for those years were increased, despite cables coming to Stalin that there's famine on the ground, we need to send food instead of requisitioning it. And despite idea that collectivizing right now, or the effects that collectivization was having on Ukraine at that time, additionally, intentional delay of famine relief. So there were some relief sent, but that relief was sent only to the industrial areas, so places that were actually more collectivized, so the southern part of Ukraine and eastern part of Ukraine, and to the factories, which are also located in there. So they said, yeah, we need these people to work, because we still need to have food next year and sow the fields and export the grain. But the relief didn't come to the areas that actually suffered the most. And the most important and probably the most damaging of all was the prohibition of population movement. People were shot at the border who were trying to cross, and this is coming back to the story that my grandmother told me, that people who were crossing at night from the other side of Ukraine and trying to deliver some of the food stuff, that some of their counterparts on the other side were shot for even trying to get this food across to them. So the population movement was really key element of why we saw the kind of deaths that we saw in those parts of Ukraine and not in others, especially because of blacklisted communities were also concentrated in that geographical area as well. So in terms of grain loans, so this is another way, the relief, if you like. So relief efforts went into these parts of the country, rather than for these parts of the country, which is really what required it at the time. So in terms of, for some reason the map is over there, but this is, I wanted to show, for example, why we saw less death in the Chernihiv region. And the reason for that is that it's a really wooded area, and the way that people survived was just going into the forest and foraging and finding whatever they could. And really, in fact, ecology explains some of this. notice some of the effects. People here were bound by a certain ecological conditions, if you like, or natural conditions. And then that sort of further told the story of who lived and who died in Ukraine. Regions that were on the border, Poland, Romania, they were also less affected a little bit, or at least they saw less of deaths. And the reason for that is the Soviet Union wanted to preserve its space internationally. It was denying the fact at the time that the famine was taking place. There were numerous cables, of course, coming out in British press and American press about the famine, but nonetheless, specifically kind of to deny further and make sure that these areas are fed. They didn't want journalists who were on this side of the border seeing these deaths or being able to penetrate further and kind of tell the story to the rest of the world. And again, the industrial areas, which I already mentioned, were less affected in terms of deaths, and the reason for that is that there was some relief out there. And they were factory workers, so they were getting more food. So in terms of the international response at the time it happened, it's interesting that, and I recently discovered this actually, and for some reason it didn't come up as it should be, but I'll try to read out what it said. This is a resolution that was presented in the US Congress in 1934. And it read, whereas the government of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, although being fully aware of the famine in Ukraine, and although having full and complete control of the entire food supplies within its borders, nevertheless failed to take relief measures designed to check the famine or to alleviate the terrible continuous conditions arising from it, but on the contrary used the famine as a means of reducing the Ukrainian population and destroying the Ukrainian political, cultural, and national rights. And it's quite striking actually to discover these bits of data in the archives, and you see that actually the population at the time was able to come across a lot of reports like this. For example, it was widely known amongst the Jewish community, interestingly, and you see a lot of reports from the Jewish communities at the time who were talking about the famine and reporting it in its press. And something that I recently also found out, that this was much widely known at the time than we today actually know about this, which is not surprising. It just happened, so the people were still discussing it. I wanted to touch on this question because there's a lot of politicization around this question today. And I've been to so many conferences where this is discussed and debated. And yet, I think each of you will leave this room with your own perception of what you think this was. Was it a genocide or not? I've studied the concept of genocide as a scholar, where it emerged, who came up with it, why, how it developed, how it was basically codified in our international law today. And it's interesting that we're not just celebrating the 85th anniversary of Ukrainian famine in a sense, or commemorating this tragedy, but this year is also the 80th anniversary of the two fundamental acts that today hold international law of human rights. The UN Declaration on Genocide and the Human Rights Declaration. So two documents that we're celebrating. And interestingly, these two men who came from the region of Western Ukraine, very close to where I was born, also Zinka, these two men who are part of cultural milieu, I'm sure my family as well, who studied in Lviv University, in Commemoration University in Lviv, are sort of the fathers of the concepts that we know today as crimes against humanity and genocide. Their work, their experience, especially the work of Lemkin, who reflected on the famine, and his works are probably a lot more than Hirsch, Lauterpacht, Sir Hirsch Lauterpacht. For those of you who don't know who he was, He was a judge in International Court of Justice, a very distinguished PC. His academic work on human rights is probably the fundamental text that every lawyer or aspiring student of international relations goes through. For those who want to study famine or genocide, they start with the work of Lemkin and his first intellectual sort of delving into the subject. And it's interesting to me when I read their work is how cosmopolitan and humanitarian they were. Lemkin, in his remarks in 1953, when he was commemorating the famine, just like we're doing now in New York, said the following. You can read this online, by the way, his essay, his remarks. The Holodomor was perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainian is not and never has been a Russian. His culture, his temperament, his language, his religion are all different. To eliminate nationalism, the Ukrainian peasantry was sacrificed. A famine was necessary for the Soviet, and so they got one to order. If the Soviet program succeeds completely, if the intelligentsia, the priest and the peasant can be eliminated, then Ukraine will be as dead as every Ukrainian were killed. For it will have lost that part of which has kept and developed its culture, its beliefs, its common ideas, which have guided it and given it a soul, which in short made it a nation. This is not simply a case of mass murder, it is a case of genocide, of the destruction not of individuals only, but of a culture and a nation. Today, there's a raging debate, in part because, sadly, the Russian government has turned away from re-examining its own past, and in part because the Russian government has decided to, for numerous reasons, align itself with the Stalin atrocities. So horrors of the Stalinist regimes today are being silenced again. Historians in Russia who work on Stalin purges, for example, are jailed. Two recently, one of them a few months ago, actually October, so this month, a Karelian historian who discovered something like a Soviet dachau in Karelia, and him and another historian who was jailed earlier, again because he was the first one who discovered it in 1993. So Russian government, sadly, under this current regime, assumed that position. There was an opening in the 1990s, it wasn't always so. Under the presidency of Yeltsin, Russia also tried to come to terms with some of these Stalinist horrors. And so it's important to understand that how politics influences this. Ukraine has argued for the, officially, and the ambassador might say more about this, has argued for the recognition of events in Ukraine as a genocide against the Ukrainian nation. But at the same time, only a few countries have recognized it. US, of course, Canada, quite a few more, but not Russia and some of the other places where regimes are more authoritarian, who himself haven't dealt with the past atrocities that their previous governments were committing. One particular scholar, and I kind of want to, in a way, destroy a little bit what I just said, because when you live in a little academic community, the differences actually are not as large. So by and large, when you read some of the kind of myths about Ukrainian famine that, or say that Russian government currently tries to say that this was not a genocide, and there's an entire campaign about it, and they usually use the work of Viktor Grashin, who wrote a very important book about the tragedy of a Russian village. But between scholars, actually the differences are not that big. It is when it's taken out of context and then blown up in the media that you begin to see something of a huge difference. But most Russian scholars who worked on this, the data is so overwhelming
there's nothing really to argue. So I'm citing him here. He acknowledges very much that the food crisis of 32 was an opportunity to stamp out Ukrainian national aspirations, and the famine of 1932-33 and the general economic crisis in Ukraine gave the Stalinist regime an excuse to adopt preventative measures against the Ukrainian national movement, and also in a distant perspective, its possible social base, the intellectual bureaucrats, the peasants. Now, I don't have time, or I didn't have time really to delve into the entire context of what steps Stalin's regime took at the time to stamp out Ukrainian national movement, because famine is only part of the story. And paraphrasing Lemkin in that sense, when you read his essay, and he probably was the first intellectual who reflected on what happened in Ukraine and said, actually, this is a system behind it. And the system was to destroy the intellectuals and the intellectual purges that occurred in Ukraine. Party leaders that were identifying Ukraine that were more nationalist, more Ukrainianist, were either killed or sent off to Siberia. Ukrainian church, which was the soul of the nation, of the country, the clergy was persecuted, again, either killed, closed, or sent off to Siberia. And the peasants we already heard about, as well as bureaucrats. So when we talk about Stalinist policy of of stamping out Ukrainian national movement, you really need to examine famine as part of those other policies that were implemented simultaneously in order to kill off any kind of attempt at national aspirations. And Ukraine was important to Stalin, and you see this from his correspondence with his closest confidants, Soviet leadership. It was all about holding on to Ukraine. And that the perception back then was that if we're going to lose Ukraine, we will put the entire Soviet experiment at jeopardy. This is what you come to conclude when you read these documents. And it's not surprising that today we see the war that we see between Ukraine and Russia. Sadly, that narrative that losing Ukraine somehow detracts from Russia's own greatness, somehow detracts from its ability to exist, and still there. So, for those of you who want to dive deeper, I've got great stuff for you. The Gates of Europe is a great primer on Ukrainian history, difficult history. It's a battlefield of empires for centuries, with some stories of sort of Ukrainian national idea reemerging, fighting these empires. But at the end of the day, I think it's one of the best accessible history books on Ukraine that's out there. It's also written by my mentor in a way, so I know that he won't mind. Anne Applebaum, her book just came out, enormously important work. It will open this subject to you in so many ways. It references practically every collected document on the subject. It references all the historians that are to date worked on this subject. It's a beautifully written book, and some of you who've read, for example, her book on Stalinist Gulag, this is the author, Anne Applebaum. So I love her writing, and here's an example of it. This is a documentary, Harvest of Despair of 1933. Very interesting, came out of Canada. It's an award-winning documentary, very difficult to watch, but it puts a lot of the sort of documentary evidence that we collected at the time by people who traveled, who smuggled things out, pictures, videos, and so on. So this is the kind of evidence that you usually don't see unless you go into archives and interact with some of the photos. So this is an important contribution. Bitter Harvest is a movie that came out a few years ago. Is an attempt to kind of, you did great, an attempt to again engage the larger public with this question. I think one of the things that Ukrainians often reference when they talk about, at least amongst the academics, I know that this discussion has happened, that there's a great admiration for how Jewish community all over the world has been able to reach others in telling of the story of what happened in the Holocaust. And it's used as an example for how we could be telling the story as well. And we know how many movies have been produced on the subject of Holocaust to educate the public. These are sometimes the first encounters that people have through popular culture about what happened. And sadly in Ukraine, this is sort of the first English-speaking film on the subject. Which again, for many generations, this would be a first introduction into the subject and kind of making it more accessible. Then once their interest grows, they can go into some of these more non-fiction accounts and trying to put the history of it in perspective. And as I already mentioned, I would encourage you to look through the materials on the website of GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems at harvard.edu. There you will find a number of projects, but one in particular is on famine and the famine web map, which you can create different forms of illustrations to understand what the data tells us. Eventually one day, if there is funding, we will see this sort of data interrogation throughout the entire Soviet Union. Kazakhstan, I know that they're trying to also do this, learning from Ukrainian examples. Scholars in Kazakhstan want to delve into this and try to understand as well what happened there. And it's important to note that when we talk about all Soviet Union, Ukrainians didn't just live here. A lot of them were in Kazakhstan, a lot of them were in parts of Russia. So there's more to story than this, and we're yet just beginning to really tell it. And engaging in forums like this and trying to figure out what happened, why happened, process it, and then hopefully take away the lessons that will move forward in producing a better future for all of us to live on. I was in part, I would say quite instrumental in making this one, Famine Story Map. We wanted to make a product that was a little bit more accessible to the public. And this particular story map, if you go to the Ukrainian Museum of National Remembrance of Genocide, of famine in Ukraine in Kyiv, you will find this in one of the portals. And I'm very proud of it because I helped to make sure that this is the content in both Ukrainian and English that is accessible to everybody, that even a child could, not a child, but a teenager could read and understand and engage with some of the maps to really tell the story of what happened. And I'm done.